ITM gents. This week I want to go back to talking about economics. My father was an accountant. He was a scholar in economics. So being brought up in that environment, a lot of my thoughts naturally come from economic perspective. This is why I'm mostly doing these videos and why I'm right wing. Now, when it comes to economics, there's basically two schools of thought. Now, there are multiple more schools of thought, but when it comes to any sort of conflict, it tends to break down and coalesce into two sides: left versus right, security versus freedom, collectivism versus individualism, things like that. So when it comes to economics, it's coalesced into these two sides as well. And the first school of economics is the more commonly understood one, the one that you are taught about in school, the one that you're taught is how we run our country, and it really is, and that is Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics was coined after a man named John Maynard Keynes, a British man who worked for the British Civil Service. And he was an economist, and his theory was that the government should have the ability to influence the economy based on government grants and adding stimulus to certain fields and industries. Now, that's very statist ideals. Keynes was a statist, but he wasn't completely statist. I mean, he was the chairman of the World Bank during Bretton Woods, so obviously he was what we would call a globalist today. But he understood there were limits to statism. So, for instance, during the Treaty of Versailles, he actually walked out in protest because he agreed with Marshal Foch. Marshal Foch said about the Treaty of Versailles that the Treaty of Versailles was not a treaty, it was just a 20-year truce. Marshal Foch was only off by a few months. So what Keynes said about the Treaty of Versailles was that forcing Germany to be indentured to the rest of the world, to essentially be slaves and be indebted to the rest of the world, would do nothing but make the next Great War inevitable. And like I said, Marshal Foch predicted it 20 years, and he was pretty close. So he did understand, because he was an actual economist, he did understand that there were limits. He wasn't like Marx. Marx was an idiot who basically never tried out any of the stuff he actually promoted. But even though we call it Keynesian economics, what we have today is much more close to what Marx preferred in his ideologies. In fact, Keynes, over the course of his life, by the time he died, had sort of opened his eyes and realized that his ideals were falling apart, that Keynesianism is not a good ideology for economics. Close to his death, I believe he actually said that he wished that Adam Smith's invisible hand could save Britain, and he was sort of ashamed that he spent the previous 20 years trying to eradicate Adam Smith's ideals. Keynesian economics. So what is the premise behind Keynesian economics? Well, what Keynes saw was that anytime an industry, anytime a system received more money into that system, generally that system got better. So he thought, well, what if we just had the government put money into that system instead? Instead of having to get private individuals, investors to put money in that system, what if we could control it and just have the government put the money in the system and speed up the process without having to have natural forces do it? That's the premise behind Keynesian economics, having the state control the economy, statism. But like I said, he did understand that there were limits. But he understood there were limits, and he would be ashamed if he saw what Keynesian economics is today. So what is Keynesian economics today? Keynesian economics today has basically advanced into full-blown Marxism. The term that we've been hearing a lot lately is MMT, modern monetary theory. That is what they've basically renamed it to. And what is modern monetary theory? Well, you've heard money printer go brr, right? That's modern monetary theory. We are $28 trillion in debt. We need more money. We have the government putting out a $2 trillion budget for the next year. Where does that money come from? It's not coming from taxes. That's not enough. So what we do instead is something called deficit spending. Now, deficit and debt are different things. You can eradicate a deficit without eradicating debt. But if you have a deficit, you are compounding debt. Deficit is simply the difference between money in versus money out. So the amount of money we get the government gets in taxes does not outweigh their actual budget. Their budget is much higher, so they have to spend money they don't have. Where does that money come from? Money printer go brr. We're just gonna print more. And when we say print, we mean add a couple of zeros on a computer somewhere. Money out of thin air. That is MMT, modern monetary theory. And if that's the case, why even tax the people in the first place? If you can just make money out of thin air, why tax the people? You're just adding insult to injury at that point. But why is modern monetary theory bad? Because it causes inflation. Why is inflation bad? Because the value of the dollar drops. Now, why does the value of the dollar dropping, why is that bad? Well, mostly it hurts poor people. If you're rich, do you care that the price of gas went up? Do you care that gas is 50% more expensive? You're rich. You don't care about the cost of gas. That's a penny pinching, irrelevant cost to you. But for the average poor person, gas price going up 50%, that is huge. That's something you notice on your bank statements at the end of the month. That is important. But let's talk about savings. Let's say you have $10,000 in the bank and the government doubles the money supply. That $10,000 is now has the buying power of half of what it had before. So if you wanted to buy $10,000 worth of goods from last year to this year, assuming that the amount of dollars in the money supply doubled, then I believe it only went up about 45%. So it's not completely doubled yet. But if you doubled it, then that $10,000 in goods now costs $20,000. You can't afford it anymore. You are basically only able to buy $5,000 in goods with your $10,000 based on the value of a year before. That is what inflation does. Inflation is a tax on your savings. So inflation, while the government can vote for more taxes to take out of your paycheck, inflation is them taxing your grandchildren, them taxing your savings without having to even vote on it. They don't even tell you they're doing it. You don't know it's happening, but it gets worse than that because it doesn't hurt rich people. It actually helps the rich people because inflation hurts savings, but it helps debt. Rich people generally don't spend their own money. What's better than spending money? Spending someone else's money. So if you can buy something for $1 million, or you can take $1 million loan and buy something instead. Now you can say, oh, but you have to pay back that loan. Yes, but if that thing you bought makes you a 12% profit and that loan only has a 4% interest rate, you just made an 8% gain on that. That's what rich people do. They basically create money out of nothing just by taking loans. So let's say you take out $1 million loan as a rich person, and then the money supply doubles. Do you suddenly owe $2 million? No, you actually still only owe $1 million, but the money supply has doubled. So based on inflation, your market value is basically, your market debt is basically equivalent to $500,000 from the year before. You basically cut your debt in half without having to do anything. So inflation specifically hurts poor people. It does not hurt rich people because rich people spend their money differently than a poor person. And there are other reasons why inflation is bad. but I've spoken about those in other videos. But we're mostly talking about MMT and the two schools of economics here. So let's continue on with that. So as I said, Keynesian economics is the idea behind government intervention. The government, Keynesians believe that the economy is a machine, and machines can be controlled. If you want a machine to do something different, you poke and prod it, and you make small changes, you add influence, and then it does what you want it to do. The problem is the influence that the government puts in is always negative, and it has unintended consequences. This is what blowback is. Now, why are there unintended consequences? Well, this is explained with the other school of economics, the right-wing school. Keynesian economics would be the left-wing school. It's the school of government control, collectivism, having the government take care of things. The right-wing school of economics would be the Austrian school of economics. It's not named after a single person because there were many people involved with coming up with these ideas. It wasn't called the Austrian school because at America's founding, because the Austrian school didn't really, that train of thought didn't really start until the mid 1800s. Around our founding, we had people like Adam Smith, who came up with the Wealth of Nations, I believe his book was called. And Adam Smith would be considered an Austrian economist today. And I think I already mentioned in this video about how Keynesian started believing in Adam Smith's ideas towards the end of his life. He wanted he started to believe in the invisible hand. So Austrian economists, instead of thinking that the economy is a machine, they think the economy is a natural living organism, an organism that you cannot control because a person does not think logically. We know this. People don't think logically. It's why men are fallible, because we are crazy. So Austrians think that you just have to let the economy do its thing, allow natural forces take care and fix the economy. So a Keynesian would think that a market crash is a bad thing. A Austrian economist would think that a market crash is a good thing. You should think that a market crash is a good thing, because what is a market crash? Market crash is not a failure of a market. Market crash is a correction to an overestimation, a correction to an overvalue. So if a market is being overvalued, the crash is the economy saying this is overvalued, we need to fix it and we need to level off. Recently we had Bitcoin. Bitcoin was overvalued. Bitcoin was being valued at $75,000, $75,000. That's insane. But nobody knows really what Bitcoin is. So everyone is just speculating. And eventually that has to settle. And that's what this market crash about 2 weeks ago was, where Bitcoin is now at 35, 37, less than 40,000. Market value of Bitcoin crashed because it was being overvalued. This is a good thing. Things being overvalued is a bad thing. So Keynesians will do everything they can to prevent a market crash. But to use an allegory to it, let's say you have a mess in your room. You want to clean up that mess? You can clean up the mess. Or you can take that mess, throw it in your closet, throw it in a big pile somewhere. And as more mess forms, throw it in another big pile. Throwing it in another big pile. This is the prevention of the crash. If you had just let the cleanup happen in the first place, you'd be fine. But instead, you're creating this big pile. Eventually, that pile is going to fall. That it has to, because the pile can only get so big. So instead of these small cleanups that need to happen, there's going to be this giant cleanup that hurts everybody involved. That is the difference between Keynesianism and Austrian economists. Keynesians will end up having a large market crash that destroys economies. The 1929 Great Depression was caused by Keynesian ideals. Basically, these ideals started with Woodrow Wilson, and I mean, Woodrow Wilson didn't know what Keynesianism was, but like I said, these names don't come around until after many years afterwards. But basically, that was what he was doing. He was doing the machine economy, the statist economy, and it got worse with FDR. FDR, even left-wing economists today will admit that FDR prolonged the Great Depression by a minimum of 7 years. The World War II did not get us out of the Great Depression. FDR did not get us out of the Great Depression. FDR kept us in the Great Depression. What got us out of the Great Depression eventually was FDR's death. We got out of the Great Depression in spite of FDR, not because of him. The 2008 market crash. We got out of that depression as well, not because of Obama, in spite of him. The Keynesian economists, the TARP packages, the bailouts, all that jazz happened, destroyed our recovery. The 2008 recovery was the slowest recovery in American history. It was worse than the Great Depression, but we recovered very slowly. We would have recovered faster if Obama had simply let the economy deal with it and market forces naturally clean it up. We would have been out faster. It would have been easier on people. But we kept it. He kept us in this recession for his entire, well, I guess for his first 6 years. After 6 years, we stopped recovering. The last 2 years of the Obama recovery were flatlined. And then Trump got elected. And then Trump said, enough with this Keynesian bullshit. And within 3 years, he had doubled the economy. One of the fastest increases in the American economy ever. Kramer on Fox Business, I think what channel he's on. Kramer said it was the greatest economy of our lives until the pandemic happened. And the pandemic allowed the politicians, the statists to take over once again and bring Keynesianism back to the American economy. And they destroyed our economy and brought it back down to the peak Obama levels. The worst level in Trump's economy was equivalent to the best level in Obama's economy. That's how strong Trump's economy was. And that was because he had people like Arthur Laffer and Stephen Moore planning his economy. These are Austrian people who follow the Austrian School of Economics who are still around today. All right. And because of it, fantastic economy. So the Austrian economy is the idea that the economy is natural and must be left to determine things on its own. So we have things like your wage. Who decides your wage? Keynesians say the government should be deciding your wage. An Austrian economist would say that the market decides your wage. Your boss decides your wage. The market determines what a job is worth. If the government says you have to pay this person $20 an hour, and then the market says this job isn't worth $20 an hour, therefore this job no longer exists. That happens. That happens all the time. You have kiosks at McDonald's because the market determined that someone serving you fast food is not worth $15 an hour. So they were replaced. Their job no longer exists. And that happens because of government intervention. Every single economic crisis in history was caused by government. Every single one. The economic crash we had this last year was not caused by a pandemic. It was caused by government lockdowns. Every single one. Find me one single economic crisis in history that was not caused by a government intervention, and then maybe I'll give you some leeway on this one. But they don't exist. I've searched. I haven't found one. Find me one. So Austrian economics is the correct economics. It's just so simple. Market forces, natural forces, even Keynes understood this by the end of his life. And yet we're still taught Keynesian Economics. It's so hard to say these phrases. Keynesian Economics, Austrian School of Economics. It's so hard to say these phrases. Okay, I just got worked up over that. But so, if you want to learn more about the Austrian School of Economics, you can look into people who wrote Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Thomas Sowell is a good read. Arthur Laffer, I've mentioned him many times, is a good read. Milton Friedman, I've also mentioned him many times, a fantastic person to look into. Sowell, Friedman, Arthur Laffer, Stephen Moore. These people have videos on YouTube. You can watch them. They're very informative. I actually don't read them. I just watch their YouTube videos. I also recommend Adam Smith, although that's kind of old. That was a long time ago. So Austrian School of Economics, the economy must be left to defend itself. The economy will recover. If a business should exist, it will exist. If a business shouldn't exist, it will die. No business is too big to fail. If a business should die, let it die. The saving of the American auto industry. I mean, I'm as jingoistic as any other person on the right, but we should not have saved the American auto industry when it floundered at the end of the Bush administration, beginning of the Obama administration. The businesses were floundering because they sucked. If you can't provide a good product, you die. End of story. Anyways, peace out, guys. See you next week.